Hey, good morning, SOC-209 Interpersonal Communications. And once again, I am Vic McInnes. I will be your instructor for this semester. To walking out of camera view there, I do have a tendency to walk around during lectures. I will try to keep everything focused right here though, okay? So that you guys can see what I'm writing on the board. And I will also try to write on the board big enough to help. Again, there's nothing I'm going to write on the board that I'm not going to tell you about. All right? A little bit later on today will be kind of unique because I will be using some PowerPoint slides. I don't normally use PowerPoint in class, but before the day is over with, as soon as I upload this lecture, I will also post the PowerPoint file onto the documents page of our Blackboard page, okay? All right, so let's start off with chapter 1 of our book, first lecture for our interpersonal communications course. And the first thing we're going to want to do is define communication. So we can talk about interpersonal communication and look at what that is. But before we look at that process, we have to sort of take a look at the entire what communication is so that we have an understanding. Now, there's a lot of different definitions of communication out there, but they all boil down to a couple of key factors that are all very similar. Your book defines it as the process of generating meaning by sending and receiving verbal and nonverbal symbols and signs that are influenced by multiple contexts. And that's an okay definition. Almost all definitions have a few key things in them that you go over and over again. Communication, one definition I found was to impart or exchange information. Okay, that's a good definition. A means of sending or receiving information. Okay, so all those things sort of roll into it. Now, we're going to find some things that are parts of this communication process. Requirements almost that you have to have in order to be able to communicate. So if you're going to send and you're going to receive, you've got to have participants. So the first thing we need to communicate are participants. Okay? You need at least 2 or more. All right? Now the book talks about, okay, I got to switch markers because you can't see that at all. Let me see if I can find a marker that works. See, it's just like a real class. You need 2 or more participants. Okay, I guess you can almost see that. All right? So, and they have to be, more importantly, they have to be knowledgeable participants. They have to be engaged actively in the communication process. We've all had instances, especially those of us who have children, where you're talking to your child or your partner, somebody that you know at the mall, a stranger you've never met before, and you're talking. And suddenly they turn and look at you and go, "I'm sorry, were you talking to me?" Okay, you haven't exchanged any information. So you have to be a knowing participant. Okay, you need a message. A message. If we're going to impart or exchange information, there has to be that information that we're imparting or exchanging. Okay? It's why you want to communicate. It can be verbal, it can be visual, it can be nonverbal. Visual would be something like the billboards out on I-20. Those are communications. It can be verbal. You can use words. It can be nonverbal. I was cut off the other day on I-20 coming to Aiken Technical College, and I promise you, I tried to communicate nonverbally with the person who cut me off. Okay? We're going to talk a little bit later on in a couple of minutes about encoding and decoding. You have to remember that when you encode and decode a message, humans aren't digital. The message you give may not be the message you think you're sending, may not be the message they receive. So be aware of that. The next thing you need is a channel. A channel. You need a means to communicate. Okay? It can be sound, it can be visual, it can be tactile. Okay? It can be any number of ways to communicate, but you have to have a means for passing that. You have to have a way to pass it. And then finally, for it to be communication, there needs to be feedback. There needs to be a way for the second person in the exchange to give information back or exchange information or react to the information that's being provided to them. Okay? If you don't have that, if there's no way, then you're not really communicating. You're pushing information, but that's not communication. Communication involves two participants, okay? And they have to be able to exchange information. So our 4 parts of our communication model are participants, message, channel, and feedback. Okay? So let's talk about the forms that this communication can take. All right? Now, your book starts off with 1. I'm going to say, okay, sure. I will mention it. And that's intrapersonal communication. And my marker's died. Intrapersonal communication. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't buy intrapersonal communication as a form of communication, and I certainly don't buy the examples given by your author. I think it's a pretty good textbook. I think he just goes a little astray here. Okay. Remember, if we go back to where you have to have multiple participants, okay, 2 or more, then you can't have interpersonal communication. Now, there will be those who will argue that prayer, where you speak to a deity and that deity speaks back, is a form of intrapersonal communication. I am not going to get into the theological arguments of that. Just be aware that there are some people who say that. Okay? But basically, the examples the author gives repeatedly is vocalization of internal thoughts, where you're talking to yourself. And we've all done it. I do it all the time. You do it all the time, where you're going into a situation and you're saying, I can do this. I'm good. I can do this. When you get ready to go in and pitch your boss for a raise, hey, I deserve this. I've worked hard for this company. I've increased the profit margin. I deserve that. But that's just you verbalizing stuff you already know. There is no definition, including the one in the book, that doesn't involve an exchange of information. So an intrapersonal communication, I-N-T-R-A personal, internal to an individual. I'm not sure what information you're exchanging. Okay? So I'm going to put it up there just because your author listed it, but I'm not really going to buy it as a form of communication. The next one, and I'm shifting markers here, so this hopefully will work, is, it's even worse, okay? The red one worked, but interpersonal. Now, interpersonal is communication between 2 people whose lives are mutually influenced by each other. Okay? Now, we hear that phrase mutually influenced by each other when we think, oh, a parent, a spouse, okay, somebody like that. But no, your life is influenced by the checkout guy at the buy-low. Okay? Your life is influenced by the person at the counter at the McDonald's. Your life is influenced by the mechanic who's working on your car and takes 4 days to get it back when he initially said it was going to take about 8 hours. Okay? The act of communicating influences each other's lives. Otherwise, it's not communication. Okay? So it's communication between 2 people whose lives are mutually influenced. Okay? The interpersonal communication has to meet some sort of relational need, need for a relationship. All right? Your need for the relationship need, when you walk into Wendy's, is you need a burger. You need food, and they need money. So you will communicate, have an interpersonal relationship, influence each other's lives in order to exchange food for money. Okay? That's a relationship need. Now, in other instances, which are more obvious, like a marital relationship, an employee-employer relationship, a pastor-parishioner relationship, those influences can clearly be much greater. Okay? But remember that interpersonal communication meets some sort of need for a relationship. Communication and in interpersonal communication, the very act of communicating itself can cause conflict. Okay? And though all of us who are married, all of us who have been involved in serious relationships, all of us who have been parents know, especially parents of teenagers, all of us who have had bosses that weren't possibly what we wanted, know that how, when, and under what circumstances they communicate can be a problem. Okay, I've had bosses that were just going like, at the end of the year, they give me my performance review, and there's clearly issues they had with the way I was conducting my job. And I go, you never mentioned any of this to me for the last 11 months. Why is this coming up now? Okay? How many of y'all have been involved in relationships of a romantic nature and looked at the other person and go, we never talk anymore? Okay? Again, and the nature of the communication, hey, listen, all you ever want to talk about is football. Why don't we talk about something else? Let's talk about a movie you've seen today. Okay, let's not just talk about how great Auburn football is. Yeah, my wife has said that before. Okay? All right? Everybody understand that? All right, the next one we're going to talk about is group communication. Now, group communication begins to expand. Okay? It's where you've got 3 or more people. Remember, if you've only got 2, it's interpersonal. So it's 3 or more people. And because there are more people involved and the dynamics can be much more harder to control, group communication has got to be more formal. Okay? If you need to communicate as a group, you have to do things like, where and when are we going to meet? Okay? You don't have to. You don't have to. With a friend, with somebody you live with, you don't have to, your children, you don't have to set up a time to communicate. You're going to see them fairly regularly. That's the nature of the relationship. But with group communication, you have to be more formal. You also have to be more formal in the structure. With group communication, there will almost always be some form of hierarchy established. Okay, the more people you get involved, you're going to have a few. If you've got 3 people, the hierarchy may be minimal, but there's always going to be that one person in that 3-person group that's going to go, okay, what decision are we coming to here? There's going to be that person that sort of pushes things along. When you get into a bigger group where you've got 8, 10, 12 people, is usually about as big as you can get for a group of communication. You begin to wonder, there begins to be a person or a group of people who really begin to drive the conversation. Okay? You also have rules in a group communication. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. Everybody's heard about the talking stick. You can't talk if you don't have the talking stick. Here's the talking stick, you get to talk now. Sometimes those rules will be very formal. Sometimes those rules can be informal. Like, if you're in a group and somebody brings up, politics, and they start talking politics, and everybody just kind of goes, and just stares at that person while they talk, and then as soon as they finish talking, they go, hey, I went to a great restaurant last night, had some really good chili cheese fries, okay? Pretty soon, everybody begins to understand that unwritten rule that you don't talk about politics in this group. And a person who doesn't get that rule and continues to violate it can eventually be ostracized from the group. Okay? And then finally, groups are more often than interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication may be there to satisfy an emotional need. Group communications are almost always task-oriented. Even if the task is, we're going to go out and see a movie. Okay, let's go see a movie. We're going to go out and get our drink on. Okay, let's go out and get our drink on. We're going to go out and we're going to, protest something. Okay? Groups always form for a purpose or a task to achieve. Even if that task is relaxation and entertainment, you're always getting together for a task. Okay? And then finally, 2 more. We have public communication. Now, public communication is something that would be something like a classroom. We're all familiar with that. Church service where you have a pastor. Political rally where you've got 15, 20,000 people. Public communication is almost always centered on the sender, who is the speaker to the audience. Okay, so communication in this case generally goes, well, you're not going to be able to see that, so I'll just tell you. The sender will push out the information, and the audience will respond and give feedback non-verbally. Now, because verbally and non-verbal, verbal means with words. Okay, at a campaign rally where you've got 15,000 people, you may chant, but your usual response is, okay, that's a non-verbal response. So in public communication, the focus is almost always on the sender. This is always intentional. Okay? You cannot get a group of 40 people together at random. Okay? It is possible, I guess, if you're like in a mall or something and somebody starts talking, but even that is intentional because the sender is going to know that people are going to gravitate to them. I can't imagine an instance where public communication is unintentional because you have to have a group of people there to listen, and groups of people just don't assemble. Okay? Public communication also for the sender, in many cases, is where we begin to experience our most anxiety. Okay? People don't mind talking, in a one-on-one relationship with their spouse. People don't mind even sitting in a group with people. They may be a little quiet, but they don't have really bad performance apprehension. Public communication, we begin to experience what most people know as stage fright. Okay, I don't call it that. It's not stage fright. Fright is a bad thing. Being frightened is something that's bad. Performance apprehension, though, you can be apprehensive and still use that to perform better. Okay, almost all good public speakers use performance apprehension to perform better. Okay, so again, and then finally, we have mass communication. Now, the defining issue of mass communication is there has to be technology involved. Okay, mass communication wasn't a thing until Gutenberg developed the movable printing press and mass amounts of mass copies of a document could be sent out. Mass communication really became a field of study in the 20th century as radio and then television and then the internet, and people began to broadcast to millions of people, and it became a much more passive thing. Up till the beginning of the 20th century, about 1915, okay, mass communication was an active a process on the part of the receiver, because you had to go out and get a book, you had to open the book, and you had to read the book, okay, or pamphlet, or newspaper, or whatever. But that involves an active engagement on the part of the receiver. With the advent of what we call broadcast technology, where you are literally casting broadly, radio, television, the internet, streaming services, suddenly it becomes a more passive process where initially the radio is on in the background. Then the television is on. You don't have to be watching it. It's just there. And now we see instances where there's a research last study I showed said that people between 18 and 24 years of age are engaging or present for 14 to 18 hours of video a day. Now, clearly they're not watching 18 hours of TV a day. That would require them to do nothing but sit in front of a TV. What it means is the TV is on when they're present in a room, and it also means that they're in some cases streaming across multiple different platforms all at the same time. Okay, we've all seen somebody that was watching something on their phone and had their tablet on their lap and had the TV on. They're streaming 3 different forms of mass communication. Are they engaging with all 3? No, they're not. Okay, so mass communication can be very passive. There's also a limited opportunity for immediate feedback. Now, somebody always jumps up and says, well, what about the late night TV shows? Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, Conan O'Brien. They are mass communicating, but they have an audience. Well, that's kind of a complex situation where they are both engaged in public communication and mass communication all at the same time. When you really get down to it and what the purpose of that audience is, that purpose of that audience is just to assist in the mass communication. Because if a comedian is standing there without an audience and nobody's laughing, nobody's ever going to watch that show. We need to feel shows like that as a community experience. So putting the audience in there, in the show, is just a prop to enhance the mass communication. Okay? So let's run through these again. Intrapersonal communication, according to your author, is a thing. I don't really buy it because there's no exchange of information. You only have one participant. It doesn't meet almost any definition of communication. There is interpersonal communication where you have two people, the participants, lost my place here. Yeah, it meets some sort of a relational need, even if that relational need is brief, okay? And the communication itself, as to how often, the nature, the regularity of the communication can be a source of conflict within the interpersonal relationship. There's group communication, where it's a small group, anywhere from 3 to 12 people. It has to be 3. If it's not 3, if it's only 2, it's interpersonal. Okay? Group communication is more structured, more formal, and has a tendency, as it grows, to become more hierarchical. There's group communication, public communication, which is something like a classroom or a church or a political rally, where you've got more than a group, and that focuses all of the activity almost on the sender. It's a push situation with feedback being mostly nonverbal. Okay? And it usually comes with increased anxiety. Finally, we have mass communication. Remember, mass communication requires some form of technology, okay? And it has a limited opportunity for immediate feedback. Okay? All right, so let's do this. We're going to look at some communication models. I'm going to have to switch to the PowerPoint, so give the projector a second to spin up. It's going to get a little dark. I think you'll still be able to see me. Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about, well, there's a definition of communication. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, PowerPoint. All right. So what we're going to be looking at now is some communication models. All right, and I've said over and over again, you're going to hear me say that the study of communication is nothing new or different. This is Aristotle's model of communication from the 4th century BCE. Okay? You have 4 parts to it. Well, 5 parts really. You have the speaker, you have the speech, you have the audience, you have the effect. Okay? And giving context to all of this is the occasion. Okay? Aristotle didn't really refer to this as communication. He referred to it as rhetoric, the art of persuading someone. For Aristotle, the most important thing of this was the effect. Okay? Because Aristotle felt that if you didn't get the effect, you were just wasting everybody's time by being up there speaking. Now, this was from the 4th century BCE. This is 2,500 years ago. Okay? In 1978, which was 41 years ago, a guy named Laswell came out with this model. You're going to see it's incredibly similar. You have the communicator, you have their message, you have the channel, you have the receiver, and you have the effect. Okay? This is Aristotle's model 2,500 years later, but instead of saying the occasion, he says the channel. That's the only difference. Okay? Now, you say, okay, so what? Laswell got rich off this model. This was the model that advertising agencies used from the late 1970s up till about 15 years ago. So they used this model for about 30 years. Communicator, message, medium, receiver, effect. Okay? Now there is a thing called dialogic theory. And dialogic theory is that all communication, especially public speaking, is engaged in a dialogue. We don't just really ever broadcast. Okay, just be aware that that's, okay? Yeah, here we go. Now we want to talk about encoding versus decoding. Okay, so language is not precise. When I use a word like mother, you may have a very positive relationship with your mother and you may think very positive things. But the person sitting next to you, okay, may have very negative implications about your mother. As it says here in encoding and decoding, the message, when you encode, this is what I mean. Decode, this is what I understand. Okay? And those can be radically different things. Okay? So when someone looks at you and starts using phrases, words that are very loaded emotionally, like patriot, American, Democrat, Republican, okay? Those can be very loaded. Conservative, liberal, okay? Those can be incredibly, just if I use the word like Christian, that can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people, okay? So what you intend to encode is not necessarily what they get out of it. And you need to be very conscious of that encoding and decoding, and that you're working on similar ideas. So here's a couple of models. This is a very linear model. This is from Shannon and Weaver in 1949. This is real straightforward. Sender sends a message, receiver receives it, receiver provides feedback. That's it. Okay? Sender, receiver, feedback. Sender, receiver, feedback. Okay? Now, we know, okay, and that's a good basic model. But we all know, anybody that's been involved in a relationship knows that that's not how it works. Okay? Because if you're engaged in a relationship with your spouse or partner, and you're like sitting there going, hey, listen, I understand what you're saying, but I really think that I'm putting the time in on this relationship for everything to work, and it's not. What happens is I understand what you're saying, and as soon as you get to that point, your partner goes, oh, they have started giving you feedback before you've ever finished your message. Okay? This is a very static model. This works really well in a hierarchical situation where I'm the father, you will listen to me. Okay? I am the husband, this is what you do. So in 1949, that was a very acceptable model for communication. But I think we all know that that's not really accurate. So later on, Newcomb came up with the ABX model. The A being the message and the sender, the B being the receiver, and what they decode. And then the X is the topic. Okay? Because the topic can influence all of this. Now, in your textbook, he refers to context over and over again. Topic can also be interpreted here as context. Okay? So the message that A encodes or think he's given is not necessarily the message that B receives. And then the context and the topic provide an environment for them to work through. And as you can see through the arrows, it's constantly a back and forth in engagement. Okay? This was a big leap ahead because this implies that everyone involved in a communication situation should be communicating all the time. Okay? But again, the key thing is both sender and receiver are sending and receiving all the time, and the messages they are sending back and forth are not necessarily the ones that are being decoded the same way they intended them to be decoded. Now, Osgood and Schramm in 1954 took it a little bit further. This is a very, very dumbed down version of their model because their model goes on for pages. It's got like 1,800. It's just, but it does show you something I like here. Okay, there is no sender and receiver in Osgood and Schramm's models. Okay, it is an ongoing process, and they identify your communicators as interpreters, not as anyone who is a sender or receiver, but they're interpreters. People are constantly encoding a message that's decoded and interpreted. They encode a response. That's the message. That's decoded, interpreted. A response is encoded. That message is sent, and this is an ongoing process. This is a massive leap forward in how we understand human communication. Okay? All right? This is Osgood and Schramm, and their interactional model shows that communication is an ongoing process. It's not, and we'll get into that, the significance of that in just a minute. This is a transactional model from Barnland in the 1970s. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. It was very key in the 1970s because it does show, remember our earlier model from 1949, where it is all one-way communication, okay? Sender, receiver, feedback. What this does is in a group environment, Barnland showed that there is an ongoing loop even in a group environment. Up to this point, people were very hung up on the fact that, you know, in a higher, we were just beginning to, if you look at the environment, the context this comes out of, Barnland started pushing this in the late 60s, early 70s. Our concept of how society should work began to break down. We were no longer so enamored with the patriarchal, hierarchical systems where, you know, in a classroom you sat and listened. We began to realize that model no longer worked. So Barnland in 1970 came out with a model where you would have senders and receivers and messages all at the same time. This works very good for a group communication environment or public communication. Now this is a helical model, and I know you're not going to be able to see it very well, so if you haven't already got these PowerPoints up from the Blackboard page, go ahead and get it. It's kind of and again, Dance came up with this in 1967, and I think this is a great model for interpersonal communication. Because here's what happens. You have P1 and P2 as your two participants. P1 says something to P2. P2 responds. Now, that engagement inherently changes that relationship. It may be infinitesimal, but every time you speak to someone, every time you communicate with them, you change your relationship, even if it's a very small amount. So P1 talks to P2. When P2 responds, P1 is no longer where they were here. Their engagement with P2 changes the nature of the relationship. So they are now up here. P1 then responds to P2, and it's over here. And they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth along this helix as long as they are engaged in a relationship. Okay, now if one of the participants dies, clearly they're no longer communicating and the relationship becomes static. But what this says is that what Dance is including in his model here is the fact that human communication is irreversible. There's a phrase out there that says you can't unring a bell. Okay? My wife's relationship with her mother is incredibly complicated and not always positive. Okay? I remember we've been married 28 years, very successful marriage. I can never, ever imagine not being married to my wife until the day I die. So don't get the impression that our relationship is any sort of trouble. But we had, when we first got married, my mother-in-law had made our wedding a miserable event. Okay, or at least she tried to. Soon after we got married, and this was in the first year of us getting married, as newlyweds often do, my wife and I were fighting over something. We were establishing our relationship. And we'll say I started the conversation. I said something, she said something, and we're exchanging. Things are beginning to get a little tense. And then finally, I got so frustrated, and when she said something about how I was behaving, I said, well, at least I'm not acting like your mother. Okay. As soon as I heard those words coming out of my mouth, before I even finished that, I was going like, damn it, that's the one thing I shouldn't have said here. So what came out was, at least I'm not acting like your mother. I am so sorry I said that. I didn't mean that. I apologize. You were not acting like... None of that made any difference. Okay? Once I made that comment, she was no longer in a position to where we were a minute ago. Okay? We had significantly changed the nature of that discussion, and to a certain extent, because we were fairly recently married, that made a big change in the nature of our relationship. Okay? Now, 28 years later, hopefully I can say something stupid like that, and it wouldn't have the impact it did that day. But you can't unring a bell. Once that gong is sounded, you can't pull that back. And human communication is irreversible. You're never going to change it. Okay? Remember, human communication, all of these models do show a few things. Communication is irreversible. It has rules. It's a learned behavior. Okay? And language is arbitrary. Remember that encoding and decoding. Human communication exists in a social context. It's irreversible. It has rules. It is a learned behavior, and language is arbitrary in that encoding and decoding. Okay. Let's go back to the whiteboard and turn some lights back on. Okay. So one of the things we also need to remember is that communication is integrated of the lives of everyone who live in any sort of society. Okay. In fact, it is communication that defines and creates societies. Now, if you want to be a hermit and you want to go live in an abandoned school bus somewhere in the mountains somewhere and eat rabbits and berries and don't ever talk to anybody, fine. You are not a part of a society. You are living among your, but if you come down and eat and buy, a burger at the Burger King, you are now engaged in society. You are communicating. Okay, so communication is integrated into the lives of everyone who live in a society. Okay? Our culture is defined by how we communicate. Okay? Artists communicate through paintings or photography or sculpture. Politicians communicate through language that they hope will attract power to. Okay, their support will communicate ideas through posters. We will communicate through words and through nonverbals. Okay. The bottom line and why this happens is one simple statement: communication meets a need. Okay? We have to communicate. Now, there are several levels of needs that we can talk about. First thing is a physical need. Now, a lot of anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists, believe that the first communication was a communication of a physical need. Okay? Eat. Okay? I'm hungry. And if you, one of the first things your child learns long before they learn formal language is they learn, something like that. My daughter used to stick her thumb out like that and do that, indicating that she wanted a bottle. Okay, they learned that at a very young age. But it's believed that when our ancient ancestors identified fire and began to cook food, that they began to come up with symbols, verbal, nonverbal symbols for food. Okay, and in some cases, those nonverbal symbols would become verbal symbols because there are cultures where some words for animals are strictly nonverbal. They're signs, okay? And you don't have a word for buffalo. You do that, okay? And that's a sign for buffalo. That is verbal communication. There are instrumental needs. So the first one is physical. The second is instrumental. Now, an instrumental need, okay, is how we get things done in our day-to-day lives. So communication has become an instrument to achieve a goal. Okay, it includes compliance-gaining communications. Okay, compliance-gaining communications is how we get people to do what we want them to do. All right, everybody knows it's how that works. All right. Well, okay, if you want to watch TV, you need to go clean your room. If you want a pay raise, I need to see more work out of you. And I don't need to see you here watching YouTube of, Friends reruns from 25 years ago. Okay? We all have those compliance-gaining communication strategies. All right? And then the books list, a whole bunch of ways to achieve compliance. Offering rewards. Hey, you do this, I'll give you some money. Okay? Threatening punishment. If you don't get in there and clean your room, no TV for the rest of the month. Okay? I'll shut off all your devices. I'll change the Wi-Fi password. which is a tool I wish I'd have had as a parent. But anyway, using your expertise. Hey, listen, I've studied this for 30 years, and I do this all the time in my public speaking classes. I'll have a student go, well, I don't think that's really means my speaking style. And I'll look at them and I'll go, I've been teaching public speaking since 1986. So really you need to listen to me. Okay? There's acting friendly. The book calls it liking. Hey, how you doing, buddy? All right, how can I get you into a new car today? Okay? That friendship to achieve a goal. Okay? There's altruism. Hey, listen, we skip debt. Okay? Hey, dude, you owe me. Okay? Who was it that told your wife that you were at work late last Tuesday? You owe me. Okay? There's altruism. Hey, listen, this would be contribute to the Red Cross so that you can feel good about yourself and good about how things work. Okay? And it's for the betterment of people. And it also lists esteem. Hey, listen, if you do this, you will be a hero in the eyes of the nation. Okay? Those all work. There's also one that they don't list in here is instill fear. And we're not going to go into that, but it does actually happen. Okay? So there's also relationship needs. Okay, so you've got physical, you've got instrumental, you've got relational. And we've already discussed this a little bit. Relational needs are needs that maintain social bonds. Okay, and we've all done this. Hey, listen, we need to go see your aunt. Spend some time with your aunt on Sunday. I hate her. She's old, she smells funny, and she always pinches my... Don't care, she's your aunt. Get in the car. Okay, we've all done that. Hey, listen, you need to go sit down with Mr. Burroughs over at the hardware store because he's thinking about pulling his ads from our radio station. You need to go over there and rebuild that relationship so that he continues to give us money. Okay? And then finally, there are identity needs. Now, an identity needs establishes who we are, okay, and how we are seen by others. Do you need to go to church to have a relationship with God? I don't think so. Okay? But a lot of people go to church because they want to be seen as people who go to church. Okay? I used to go to a church over in Augusta that there was an elected official who I never saw in church until 6 months before the next election was coming up. And then that bad boy showed up at church every Sunday. Talked, read the Bible, quoted scripture, never showed up for 3.5 years. But in that 4 to 6 months before that next election, and everybody knew it. He vanished after, we showed up just before an election. He vanished. I said, hey, what happened to so-and-so? And they said, oh, he'll be back when he needs to get reelected. Okay, so there's those identity needs. All right, we also do things to reinforce. We get into interpersonal communication and to reinforce our identity. Okay, we like to talk to people who we think understand who we are. Okay? All right, so the needs that communication can meet are physical needs, which are, again, food, water, the basics of life. Okay, there's instrumental needs, how we get things done on a day-to-day basis. There's there's relational needs, how we establish and maintain relationships between people. And then there's identity needs, how we are seen by others. And to a certain extent, how we use communication to reinforce our own identities. Okay? All right, closing out here, headed toward the end. So let's talk about one of the things you need to be able to effectively communicate, okay, is communication competence. Okay? You have to have knowledge, You have to have knowledge not only of communication techniques, but you actually have knowledge as in you have to have information to communicate. You have to have an ability, okay, to use communication techniques. And then you also have to have some context to communicate in. Okay? So, knowledge, ability, context. All right? So, let's say, when we were stationed in the United Kingdom, we went to France. I spoke very, very little French. Got better as I go along. I have a tendency to be able to pick up languages really quickly. So I did not have a lot of knowledge. I did not have a lot of ability, okay? My ability was, limited to, in a certain extent, certain key words, okay? And I did not always understand the context, okay? Because French culture is radically different than American culture. So I did not understand the context all the time, and sometimes that led me into trouble. Okay, I did not necessarily know that you went over here to order something and you went over there to pick it up. So when I just walked up to the counter, I get ignored, and then finally somebody looks at me and says, here's me speaking to my wife or my kids, and they said, oh, you're American, go stand over there. Order over there, pick up over there. Okay, great, thanks. Okay, now, one would hope, certainly Father Rogers and Dr. Mahan, who's the president of the college, think that when it comes to public speaking, I am very competent. Okay? I have a great knowledge of how to run a classroom. I have a great knowledge of public speaking and communication and interpersonal communication techniques. I have a good ability to stand in front of a classroom and maintain and control that classroom and lead that classroom through public speaking exercises. And I understand the context really well of secondary education at a local technical college like Aiken Tech. So when it comes to communication competency, I am not always competent in all environments, but there are some environments where I am incredibly competent, okay, or I'm perceived as being incredibly competent. And people that are just like that, okay? People that when they're talking to their significant other, their partner, their spouse, their boyfriend, girlfriend, they're very relaxed, they're very open, they're very engaging. They have both the knowledge, the ability, and the context to communicate and be competent. Okay? But then you put that person in front of their boss, they don't have the knowledge they need to work well, they don't have the ability to communicate well, and they don't understand that employee-employer relationship. So they are not competent communicating in that environment. Okay, one of the problems and one of the things that is very universal, okay, is when you have to engage with law enforcement on a formal level. When you get pulled over, you get questioned, okay? Well, that's not something you do every day, and you don't necessarily know what the police officer wants from you, so your knowledge is not there. Your ability to communicate because of things going on internal to you and that communication apprehension lowers your ability, and you sometimes don't know why you're there or why you've been stopped or why the police officer is talking to you. That makes you incredibly, it lowers your communication competence, so you don't communicate with the officer very well, and that can lead to some pretty dire consequences. Okay? Now, what I would tell you to do is to reshape that, those areas where you don't feel like you have high communication competence, is you reshape that, okay? You redefine the relationships. One of the things I had to do when I was employed with the Department of Defense is I had to brief 4-star generals, cabinet members, things along those lines, and I reshaped those because when I was briefing them, even though they mandated respect, okay, and I understood that context, I also understood that I had the knowledge that they needed, and I had an ability to communicate that knowledge. So I reshaped it as a very respectful teaching environment, okay? And I got away with a lot of stuff in talking to very senior officials that other people would never get away with, okay? I wasn't disrespectful, but I was very low-key. I was very, I tried to use humor whenever I possibly could, okay? All right, so that's chapter 1. That is the lecture for chapter 1. What I need you to do now is before next Thursday at noon, jump online, look at those 3 exercises at the end of the chapter, and pick one of the 3. Now, when you go into Blackboard and you're going to post your exercise, your discussion of that 1, 2, or 3, I want you to put exercise number 1 at the top so we immediately can cue in. So not only do you have to post your exercise, you'll also then have to post 3 comments. Now, I'm going to ask you to do that in 2 phases. I'm going to ask you to post everything, post your discussion, your exercise discussion, and then come back and leave 3 comments on 3 other students' discussions. It's 2 separate events, because if you don't do it that way, if you plan on knocking it out all at once, everybody waits till Thursday at 11:45 a.m., and then you wind up everybody dumping and trying to get comments in. So get your discussion up there as quickly as possible, and then go in and put your comments on other people's discussions further on in the week. Let's get the discussions up there, your exercise comments as quickly as possible, so that we can generate more content and generate discussions. Now, I say, and I know I'm talking to this isn't going to be listened to a lot, but I want you to think about this. I would like to see this be very interactive. If someone makes a comment about your exercise submission and you have some questions, I'd love to see you go back and ask them questions. Okay? I would love to see a conversation happening on these discussion boards. Okay, the last thing I want to say concerning these exercises. If you look at exercise, I believe it is number 2. Okay? It asks for you to discuss someone who is not in the class. Pick someone, I forgot to bring the chapter in, but it says, discuss a person you know. I don't want you to give us information so that we can identify that person, okay? Use their first name only, use a letter, person X, we'll call them person J, whatever. I don't want you to give us enough information to where we can identify them. One of the things I've run into in the past is where somebody will say, my brother Dave, not his real name. And then I'll send them an email and say, hey, how many brothers do you have? And they go, well, 1. So we know who that is. Okay? So don't give us information that would allow us to identify them even if we didn't have their name. I don't think anybody's going to divulge anything or get us into any legal issues. I just don't want this to, become personal or anything like that. If you're going to want to talk about your spouse or your partner, you should really talk to them about it first, just as a common sense thing, because you don't want to start posting about somebody you're in an ongoing personal relationship with and just have them, wake you up in the middle of the night screaming at you because they happen you left your Blackboard up. And what do you mean you're talking about us doing that? Okay? So make sure you do that. All right? You can email me any questions. You can post any questions on the discussion boards as well. Okay? Let me know what you need. And that's chapter 1. You have until Thursday at noon to do your other homeworks for 25 points. And this is how we're going to work for the rest of the semester. All right, take care. Everybody have a good, safe weekend. And we will be looking for you online.